The 2026 World Cup was supposed to be a celebration of football's global expansion, a triumphant coronation for FIFA's grand vision of a 48-team tournament spread across 3 North American nations. But something happened in the first week of this competition that nobody could have predicted and nobody had planned for. And that something was not just one result, but a series of moments that collectively exposed the fault lines running through the modern game. And at the center of this seismic shift was the 15th of June 2026, when Spain, the reigning European champions, a team ranked among "I need you to do something for me." Subscribe to this channel right now and video like me, the top 3 in the world. A squad filled with superstars who had conquered every trophy available to them took to the pitch for their first group stage match against Cape Verde, a nation of islands in the Atlantic Ocean with a population of roughly 560,000 people playing in only their second World Cup ever. And what happened over the next 90 minutes was not just an upset, it was a football earthquake that sent shockwaves through every corner of the sport, because when the final whistle blew, the scoreboard read 0-0 and the world stood still trying to process what they had just witnessed, and that result became the defining story of the tournament's opening week. But it was never just about that one match, because across the first 5 days of this World Cup, a series of episodes unfolded that painted a picture far bigger than any single scoreline. And that picture revealed a tournament teetering on the edge of something uncontrollable, a competition where the players, the teams, and the nations themselves were pushing back in ways both public and private against the enormous framework that FIFA had constructed around this event. And these acts of resistance were not coordinated, they were not planned in some secret meeting room, but they all emerged from the same wellspring of tension, the same exhaustion, the same questioning of whether this tournament was being built for the people playing in it or for the television screens broadcasting it. And the first and most visible act of defiance came from the biggest star on the biggest stage when Brazil's Vinicius Jr., one of the most electrifying players in world football, walked off the pitch at halftime of his team's opening match and refused to participate in the mandatory interview that FIFA requires every player to give. And this was not a quiet refusal. It was a public statement, a deliberate choice to reject the commercial machinery that has grown so massive around this sport, that it now consumes everything, including the players themselves. And Vinicius Jr. made it clear that he was willing to pay whatever fine FIFA imposed on him, because for him, the principle was worth more than the money. And this moment resonated deeply with players across the tournament, because they understood that he was not just refusing an interview, he was refusing the endless cycle of obligations that treats them not as athletes, but as content producers whose primary value lies in what they can generate for broadcast partners and sponsors. And his action became a symbol of a broader frustration that had been simmering for years, a frustration with the way FIFA's commercial interests increasingly overshadowed the human elements of the game, and the fact that this refusal happened in the first week of the tournament set a tone that would carry through everything else that followed. And it was not an isolated incident, because while Vinicius Jr. was making headlines with his public defiance, other players were mobilizing in a different way, a quieter way, but one that carried its own kind of power. And that mobilization took the form of an open letter signed by dozens of players demanding stronger heat safety measures at the tournament. And this was not a theoretical concern, it was a matter of life and death, because the 2026 World Cup was being played across 3 countries in the middle of summer, with temperatures soaring to dangerous levels in many of the host cities, and players were being asked to perform at the absolute limit of human physical capability while running on pitches that felt like furnaces under the blazing sun. And the players who signed that letter were not asking for anything unreasonable. They were asking for longer cooling breaks. They were asking for independent temperature monitoring. They were asking for the tournament organizers to take the health and safety of the athletes seriously. And what they got in response was something that felt to many like a dismissive gesture, a response that prioritized the rhythm of television broadcasting over the well-being of the people actually playing the matches, because the cooling breaks that FIFA did implement seemed to be timed not for when players needed them most, but for when they would fit most conveniently into the commercial breaks that generate billions of dollars in advertising revenue. And this was the moment when the mask slipped for many observers, because it became impossible to ignore the fundamental question that was hanging over the entire tournament, which was whether FIFA was running a football competition or a television show. And the answer that many players and fans came to was that the line between those two things had become so blurred that it was no longer visible at all. And this sense of commercial interest overriding basic human considerations was not limited to the heat protocols, because the expanded format of the tournament itself was creating logistical challenges that bordered on the absurd, and teams were traveling more than ever before, crisscrossing 3 enormous countries, sometimes flying thousands of miles between matches and then being expected to perform at peak physical condition against opponents who had been able to stay in one place and conserve their energy. And the coaches and players who spoke about this issue did so with a weariness that suggested they were not just complaining about inconvenience, they were genuinely concerned about the toll this was taking on their bodies and their performances. And one of the most extraordinary stories of this logistical nightmare involved the Iranian national team, which faced challenges that went far beyond tired legs and jet lag, because reports emerged that Iranian officials had been denied visas, causing administrative chaos that forced the team to adopt an almost unimaginable arrangement where they stayed in Mexico and crossed the border into the United States for their matches. And this was not just a matter of inconvenience, it was a profound disruption to their preparation and their focus. And yet, despite these obstacles, the Iranian players continued to compete, showing a resilience that deserved far more attention than it received. And their situation highlighted something deeply problematic about the way this tournament was organized, because if a team representing a sovereign nation cannot even secure visas for its officials in a timely manner, then the entire premise of a global competition begins to feel hollow. And the fact that Iran had to navigate this bureaucratic nightmare while also trying to prepare for the highest level of international football was a testament to their professionalism. But it was also an indictment of the systems that were supposed to support them. And this was not an isolated incident, because smaller nations across the tournament were discovering that the gap between them and the traditional football powers was not as wide as everyone had assumed. And Cape Verde's draw with Spain was the most dramatic example. But it was far from the only one, because the first week of the tournament was filled with moments where teams from smaller countries or less heralded footballing nations pushed their more celebrated opponents to the limit. And in doing so, they challenged the entire narrative that FIFA had constructed around this expanded format, because the governing body had sold the 48-team tournament as a way to grow the game and give more nations a chance to participate on the world stage. But they had also assumed that the traditional hierarchy would hold, and that the established powers would dominate as they always had. And what the first week of the 2026 World Cup proved was that this assumption was no longer valid, and that the gap between the haves and the have-nots in international football was shrinking faster than anyone had anticipated. And this was not just about tactics or talent, it was about mentality, because teams like Cape Verde approached their matches with a belief that they could compete with anyone. And that belief was not just empty optimism. It was grounded in the reality that modern football has made it possible for smaller nations to close the gap through better organization, improved fitness, and a globalized talent pool that has spread footballing knowledge to every corner of the planet. And when Cape Verde walked off the pitch with a point against Spain, they were not just celebrating a result, they were making a statement about the changing nature of international football. And that statement was amplified by every other smaller nation that held its own against a giant, because together they were proving that the era of guaranteed victories for the traditional powers was over, and that the 2026 World Cup was going to be a tournament where nothing could be taken for granted. And this unpredictability was exactly what FIFA had promised when they expanded the tournament. But it was also exactly what they had failed to prepare for, because their entire model of organizing and broadcasting this competition was built around certain assumptions about which teams would advance and which matches would draw the biggest audiences, and the chaos of the first week threatened to upend all of those calculations. And the tension that emerged from this uncertainty was not just about results on the pitch, it was about the broader relationship between the players, the teams, and the governing body that was supposed to be serving them. And the 5 distinct revolts that characterized the opening days of this tournament were all expressions of the same underlying truth, which was that the people at the heart of this competition, the players who were risking their bodies and their careers, were demanding to be treated as something more than pieces in a commercial machine. And Vinicius Jr.'s refusal to do a halftime interview was a rebellion against the endless commercial obligations that treat players as products to be marketed, and the players who signed the heat safety letter were rebelling against a system that seemed willing to sacrifice their health for the sake of broadcast schedules. And the logistical chaos that teams like Iran faced was a rebellion against the bureaucratic indifference that made their participation so unnecessarily difficult. And the smaller nations like Cape Verde were rebelling against the assumption that they did not belong on the same pitch as the traditional powers. And all of these rebellions were connected by a common thread, which was the growing recognition that FIFA's management of this tournament was not serving the people who actually make the sport what it is. And the irony was that this recognition was emerging at the very moment when FIFA was celebrating the greatest expansion in World Cup history. And the first week of the tournament was supposed to be a celebration, but instead it became a reckoning, and the reckoning was not just about the results. It was about the fundamental questions that the tournament was forcing everyone to confront, questions about the direction of the sport, questions about the priorities of its governing body, and questions about what the World Cup actually means in the 21st century. And as the first week gave way to the second, these questions did not fade away. They grew louder because every match, every press conference, and every player interview seemed to add another layer to the story of a tournament that was spinning out of the control of the people who had planned it, and the players at the center of this storm were not just passive participants, they were active agents in shaping the narrative, and they were using their platforms to speak out in ways that would have been unthinkable in previous generations. And this was perhaps the most significant development of all because it signaled a shift in the balance of power between the players and the governing body. And the players were no longer content to simply show up and perform. They wanted a seat at the table, and they wanted their voices to be heard. And the events of the first week of the 2026 World Cup proved that they were willing to take bold actions to make that happen. And the governing bodies were caught off guard by this because they had grown so accustomed to the old order where players were seen and not heard, and where the commercial and organizational decisions were made by people far removed from the actual playing of the game. And the first week of the tournament was a wake-up call that the old order was crumbling and that a new era was dawning in international football. And the result between Spain and Cape Verde was the most visible symbol of that new era, but it was also just the beginning because the tournament was still in its early stages and there were many more matches to be played and many more stories to be written. And the tension that had built up in those first 5 days was not going to dissipate. It was going to intensify, and the players and teams who had already made their voices heard were not going to stop. They were going to keep pushing, and the governing bodies were going to have to respond whether they wanted to or not. And the world was watching because this was not just a football tournament anymore. It was a drama about power and resistance and the future of a sport that billions of people around the globe hold dear. And the 2026 World Cup had become something that nobody planned for, but everyone was talking about. And it was the unpredictability and the tension and the rebellion that made it so compelling. And the fact that no one could have predicted any of this was precisely what made it so important, because it forced everyone involved to confront the reality that the game they loved was changing, and that the change was coming from the players and the teams themselves, and the response to that change would determine the future of international football for generations to come. And as the tournament continued to unfold, the world waited to see what would happen next, because the first week had already delivered more drama than anyone could have imagined. And the promise of the weeks to come was that there was even more to come, and the players had shown that they were not afraid to challenge the system, and the smaller nations had shown that they could compete with anyone, and the governing bodies had been forced to confront the limits of their power, and the commercial interests that had seemed so all-consuming were suddenly being questioned in ways that they had never been questioned before. And the fans who had come to the stadiums and the billions watching on television were witnessing something historic, because they were seeing the sport they loved being reshaped in real time, and they were seeing the people who actually play the game taking control of their own destiny. And that was the story of the first week of the 2026 World Cup, a story of rebellion and resilience and the relentless pursuit of a better and fairer game. And it was a story that nobody had planned for, but everyone would remember for the rest of their lives. And the legacy of that week would be felt long after the final whistle of the tournament, because the players had shown that they were not just athletes, they were agents of change. And the teams had shown that they were not just competitors. They were representatives of nations and cultures, and the governing bodies had been reminded that the sport belongs to the people who play it and the people who love it, and not to the corporations and the broadcasters who have tried to claim it for themselves. And that was the real victory of the first week of the 2026 World Cup, a victory not measured in goals,